Our first session here will be on navigating your ArchivesSpace implementation from Marie Lyons of Atlas Systems. Titled, We're on the Road to Somewhere, Navigating Your ArchivesSpace Implementation, this presentation will focus on what institutions should consider when starting an ArchivesSpace implementation, including creating a project plan for the process, tools and resources for importing legacy data, training, and engaging with the ArchivesSpace community. Marie Lyons is a training and library solutions consultant at Atlas Systems. She's been with Atlas for 10 years and works with special collections and archives customers on their ArchivesSpace and Aeon implementations. Prior to working at Atlas, she was a digital initiatives consultant for special collections and archives in Denver, Colorado, a cataloger at the National Security Archive in Washington, D.C., and a part-time librarian in the NPR library. Marie, if you'd like to take it away.
Yes, thank you, Jessica. Hello, everyone. I am going to share out my screen. And welcome to this presentation. We're on the road to somewhere, navigating your ArchivesSpace implementation. An earlier version of this presentation was presented at last year's online forum, and we decided to present it again based on interest that was shown from people who were registering this year. And I'm just going to make sure this fills my screen. There we go. Okay, so the title, We're on the Road to Somewhere, was inspired by the Talking Heads song, Road to Nowhere, which might be how an implementation can sometimes feel. So I'm here to put a positive spin on things and give you some tips to help get your implementation on a roadmap to somewhere. So as I mentioned, this is an encore presentation created by myself and also Madeline Sheldon, the Lyricist member representative. Madeline could not present this week, so I'm going to be presenting our material for both of us. The presentation has been updated with some new information and to reflect some changes from content that we had last year. So this is our agenda. We'll get started with our implementation discussion by talking about how to identify your goals for ArchivesSpace. We'll then take those goals and put them into action by exploring project plans. I'll also discuss a number of different tools for getting your existing description data into ArchivesSpace. And if you're new to ArchivesSpace, most likely you'll want to take a look at some training materials. And then I'll wrap up with some very supportive community resources that you should know about it. I'm going to be discussing these topics in a very linear order, but if you're actually doing an implementation, most likely you're working on things at the same time because certain areas are going to inform other areas. Before I get into the implementation part, I wanted to talk a little bit about acquiring ArchivesSpace. This section is new material. The last time we presented, we picked up from the point after a decision would have already been made about how the archive system would be hosted, either self-hosted or hosted by a third party. And for this year, since we have some extra time, I'm going to step back and talk a little bit about what I mean when I say self-hosted or hosted by a third party. So anyone can use ArchivesSpace. It is open source. You can download it, put it on a machine that meets minimum specifications, which I'll talk about in a little bit. I have a couple of ArchivesSpace versions downloaded on my laptop that I run at different times so that I can test things on different versions for our customers. So you are free to download ArchivesSpace and you can start using it as it is. Depending on how you want to use it, for example, if you want to make it available to your patrons, then you'll need to do a few configurations, but it basically works out of the box as it is. And just check in. Okay. So the ArchivesSpace consists of what I would call a backend. So that's the application itself, all of the files that make up ArchivesSpace, and the database that's going to contain all of that description data that you're going to be adding to ArchivesSpace. And then people are going to be interacting with that data using different interfaces or different methods. So staff people can access the data using the staff interface, which is available as a website. Savvy staff people who know how to write scripts can access that data using the ArchivesSpace API service, which is API's Application Programming Interface. And then everyone, the public, can access that data, that published data, using the public user interface, which you'll hear referred to as PUI. And that's also accessible in a browser. You don't have to use the PUI. Some libraries just use the staff interface, and then they export their finding aids, and they may upload them into another search discovery system. If you want to run ArchivesSpace seriously, though, in what we would call a production environment where it's available to multiple staff members and patrons, these are the minimum specifications you're going to be looking at. So you'll need a machine. You're going to have some memory to make sure it's running well. I mentioned on the previous slide that ArchivesSpace does come with its own database, but you're going to need something more robust if you want to run it at a production level. We use MySQL, and you have also this Maria database. And this web link here will bring you to a page that explains those specifications more. So you have the option to host or run and manage your own ArchivesSpace server, or you can have a third party do it for you. And when you're deciding about your options, these are the questions you'll want to be thinking about. So do you have the resources, first of all, to meet those minimum specifications? Are you or is someone on your staff tech savvy? Do you know your way around an application? There's many different kinds of files on the ArchivesSpace backend. Occasionally you might run into an error, and it helps to understand activity logs and error logs to see what might be going on. Another thing to consider is if you have dedicated technical support, and by dedicated, I mean dedicated to your library or your archive, where you can get a response back quickly if you need something done with the ArchivesSpace system. And that could be challenging for libraries and archives that share IT across a campus-wide system or an organizational-wide system. Other things to consider, if you are going to run your own server, can you keep up with the maintenance, the updates, the security, who's going to be in charge of backups, and also updating ArchivesSpace. So if you answered yes to all of those questions, then you are most likely in a great position to host your own ArchivesSpace system, which is a great option and could be very rewarding, especially if you want to do some of your own programming. So there are links here to get you started on that. And there's a number of resources related to the installation of ArchivesSpace, depending on what kind of machine you're going to be running. So this link that I have here is a great resource. If you answered no to, I would say, even just some of those questions on the previous slide, then consider working with a registered service provider. And there is a list maintained on the ArchivesSpace website. These registered service providers are also community members that support ArchivesSpace, and they offer a couple of other things that could help you. So you'll find that information on the website. One other thing to think about as you're getting started with ArchivesSpace, and that is to consider becoming an ArchivesSpace community member. As I mentioned, ArchivesSpace is open source, and it lives and dies by the engagement of the community. You are not required to be a member of ArchivesSpace to use ArchivesSpace, but it's wonderful if you can do that, and there are a number of benefits for you. You will be supporting that ArchivesSpace development. You will have a voice in shaping the future of ArchivesSpace. You'll also have access to documentation and tutorials. I'm going to actually show you what those look like when we get to the training portion of today's presentation. You'll have access to technical support and a number of other membership resources. And there are different types and levels of membership that you can take a look at and see what you would best belong to. All right, so we are going to get started with the implementation. First up on our implementation roadmap is to identify your hopes and dreams for using ArchivesSpace. And one way you could do that is to ask yourself some questions. So why did you decide to use ArchivesSpace? Perhaps you didn't decide. Perhaps someone just told you to. Or perhaps your current system is no longer going to be supported. Think about what else you can gain from using ArchivesSpace. What features do you like about it? What functionality will add value to what you already do? If you feel like you can't really answer those questions because you don't know anything about ArchivesSpace at all, then I highly recommend you check out the ArchivesSpace Sandbox. This gives you access to both the staff and public interfaces. And if you go to that site, it'll explain to you how to log in. You can practice putting your own finding aids in there. You can see what that experience is like. You can then take a look on the public user interface and see how they would display to your patrons. Another question, do you plan on adding legacy data to ArchivesSpace, your existing description data? Or are you going to start from scratch? Either way, this could give you an opportunity to flesh out some description ahead of time or to clean up some data beforehand. And based on what you're learning about with ArchivesSpace, does it look like you'll be able to do anything new or improved, either for researchers or for your staff? For example, we've heard from a few archives that they've decided to include accessioning as part of their ArchivesSpace tasks, recording the accessions, when in the past those records had been kept in a separate system or sometimes on paper. So ArchivesSpace is giving them an opportunity to put all of that information in one place. What about being able to link your description records to digital materials that you might already have posted elsewhere, such as on Content DM? Or anywhere else. Also, could there be changes to staff processes, such as more consistent and complete data entry? ArchivesSpace could also be an opportunity to integrate with other systems, such as a digital object system or your ILS. So it's that sandbox I just showed you. Another option, going back again to that idea that anyone can download ArchivesSpace, you could always download it locally and play around with it. And like I said, that's what I've done on my own laptop. You can use the embedded database if you're just using it on a standalone. And this is where you could practice more advanced functions like importing data, customizations that you can make to the public user interface, plugins, etc. So you could use that sandbox or you can download your own version. So once you've done some brainstorming on what you would like to gain from ArchivesSpace, it's then time to flip those hopes and those dreams into specific goal statements. And these questions could help you specify exactly what your objectives are for ArchivesSpace, which are generally going to revolve around what new or improved services can you offer to researchers, and what new or improved functionality or processes can you offer to staff. Staff is a substantial user group that ArchivesSpace will meet the needs of. So here are some examples of defined goal statements. Our first one, one-stop shop archival management system that will manage accessions, our resources, our finding aids, and links to digital objects all in one place. Provide a front-end interface for patrons to perform their own research and discover things for themselves easily and efficiently. And decrease staff time spent on answering repetitive reference questions. So goal statements should have some sort of measurability in them. Think about what you can measure down the road to show that you've met your goals. Once you have those goals planned out, you'll want to decide on what content you'll get started with in ArchivesSpace that's going to satisfy those particular goals. So for example, if cutting down on reference questions is a goal for you, then look to work on commonly used materials or descriptions that only exist on paper, or perhaps materials that your organization is known for. If you need to increase archives use, then work on descriptions for your hidden collections and perhaps digital materials. If you just need to get some content into ArchivesSpace, you have some stakeholders who are waiting to see things get entered into their brand new system, you can work on descriptions or collections that are updated often, maybe that you get increments for often. Perhaps you're super lucky and a donor included some financial support for description work. Another thing is what's easiest to get into ArchivesSpace, whether possibly based on its format or its content. Once you've prioritized the content you're going to start with in ArchivesSpace, decide on which types of ArchivesSpace records that you're going to use for that content, because that could also determine additional pit stops you'll have to make along the way. So some pit stops might be short, some might be longer. Here's just a few examples. If you're interested in using name authorities, which are called agents in ArchivesSpace and subject records, take a little bit of time to learn the Library of Congress LCNAF import plugin. It comes already built into ArchivesSpace. It's enabled from the get-go, and it allows you to import names and subjects directly from the Library of Congress into ArchivesSpace. It takes like 5 to 10 minutes to learn. If you have plans to use top container records, that's going to be things like your boxes that hold your archival materials. It could be to your advantage to make sure they're barcoded. It gives you a lot more functionality if you have to do bulk things on your boxes, such as if you're doing a big move. ArchivesSpace does math. There is a space calculator that can figure out where there is free space in your archive for things like new acquisitions, increments, etc. But one of the things that you'll need to do ahead of time is to map out your storage area and get it into ArchivesSpace. So if that's something you're interested in doing, you're going to want to plan for that during your implementation. There are also event records. Those are a great way to record actions that have been taken upon your description records or the materials. And you might want to decide ahead of time which event records staff are going to consistently use. Next stop on our roadmap, creating a project plan. So after or while you're figuring out your goals and deciding on the content that you want to put into ArchivesSpace, we highly recommend that you start writing up some form of a project plan. Project plan is going to identify who will you need in your department, in other departments, IT, third party for server hosting, outside of your organization, especially if you're a lone arranger, who can you depend on? What will you need? What tools? What resources? When? Do you have deadlines? Do you have specific milestones you have to reach for legacy data input, for new content, for going live with the public interface? So you want to identify some sort of work schedule in that project plan. How? How will you meet your goals? What will your priorities be? What are you going to work on first? What's going to be your step-by-step process? And then why? Which goal is each of your priorities helping to satisfy? So this is a snippet from an assessment questionnaire that Atlas uses with organizations to help them start devising a project plan. So we have questions in here about data expectations, types of materials we'll be working with, how formally organized the implementation will be, timeline, and what the plans are for the public user interface. Next, think about how much of a project plan do you need? So some questions to ask. Do you have anyone else helping you? How formal should you be? Do you have a large team of people helping out, and are they going to be organized into task forces? Are they going to be responsible for phases of adoption? If that's the case, you're going to need a formal plan to track all of that and to make sure that everyone understands their role in that. Or is it just you? Do you have deadlines or scheduled milestones that you have to be accountable for? A project plan is going to keep you on track, even if it's just you. So no matter what your answers are to the questions on the previous page, we highly recommend the following. Definitely create a project plan. Write out your goal statements at the beginning of that project plan, because the plan is going to outline specifically how you will reach those goals. And you can also do one project plan per goal statement, whatever makes sense. Identify and order your priorities, because you cannot work on everything at once. So decide how you will prioritize. What's most important? Who do you have to answer to? What's most convenient? What do you have funding for? So once you have your priorities in order, you'll use them as the outline, the structure of your project plan. Identify your human resources, so staff members who will have roles in the implementation, or if you're a lone arranger, who are your external contacts? And the first place I recommend going is local professional chapters, and see if you can do a site visit to someone else who is using ArchivesSpace. I've had a number of customers that work with us that have done that and found it very rewarding. So see if you can find someone local who's using ArchivesSpace. Also identify similar repositories or that have similar collections, and take a look, at their public user interface. How are they doing things? How are they doing description? Which ArchivesSpace fields are they using? And then finally, for everyone, commit to a schedule to work on the implementation. And one of the best ways I find that, whether you're working with a team or you're on your own, is to put automatically recurring meetings on your calendar. So every Friday from 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m., I am working on ArchivesSpace, and I do recommend weekly. Anything longer than that is sometimes hard to get back into the swing of things. So why go through all of this trouble? It keeps you organized, it keeps you moving, and if you do have to stop implementation work because of other projects, which is probably likely, it'll be much easier to know where you left off when you can finally get back to ArchivesSpace. It also makes your implementation work visible, because it is work and it will take up your time. And you never know what could come of it. You could have a journal article that you can publish, or you could come up with a new implementation process to share with others. The end result of your project plan should be documentation of your decisions. So that is going to be everything that you decided is going to be in a formal document that you are going to use from that point forward. And if you would like to see some examples of formal documentation, we recommend SAA's Collection Management section. They have they have a documentation portal, and one of the products in there is ArchivesSpace, and there's a number of libraries that are sharing their manuals. Another great resource that I'm going to come to time and again during this presentation is the awesome ArchivesSpace list, which is a linked bibliography of resources from other users. And you will find links to trainings and documentation, as well as to implementation. So here's an example of a project plan, and this was organized by priorities to support the goal of cutting down on time spent on reference requests. This library was starting off with one of their most requested resources, and then moving on to other requested resources with descriptions that only existed in print. We also use an online project management tool. There are a number of them available. We happen to use Asana, which allows us to build an outline to keep track of our implementation. Gives us a workspace to create individual tasks that we can prioritize. You can even assign them to specific people. You can assign them due dates. You can add comments. You can upload files. And this is a nice segue into other tools you'll want to look at on your implementation roadmap, particularly for importing legacy data. So you probably have previous description data that you want to get into ArchivesSpace in order to have your descriptions in one place. Before you start importing legacy data, we have more questions for you to ask yourselves. So first of all, what kind of formats does your current description exist in? Or more accurately, if you export your current description from another system, what kinds of formats are they going to export as? So file formats like CSV, comma-separated values, XML, EADs, those are nice formats that can typically be imported into ArchivesSpace. Think about the quality of your description data. Is it normalized? When I hear the word normalized for data, I always think of dates. So are your dates formatted correctly? Are they consistent? How many people have you had doing description over the years? Most likely there's a lot of inconsistencies in there. What I recommend with this, when you're taking a look at the data that you have now, to go to that ArchivesSpace sandbox I talked about earlier and look and see, for example, if you're looking at your own resource or finding aid records, take a look at the resource record in the ArchivesSpace sandbox and make note of the required fields and what, if any, formats are required for the way the data is structured in those fields. And that's a good place to start comparing your data to that data, give you an idea of what you're going to have to clean up ahead of time. You can also think about if you do have messy data, which everybody does, so don't feel bad about it. Is there stuff you want to clean up ahead of time? Is it going to be easier to do that ahead of time? Or will it be easier to migrate first to ArchivesSpace and clean it up afterwards? And that's where you could get great usage out of the ArchivesSpace API service that I mentioned earlier. That is where you can create scripts and make bulk changes to various records. So if you have somebody with good understanding of API, holding off on cleaning up your data could be a option for you. Number 4, whatever previous system you're working with, make a backup of it before you do anything. So make sure there's always something you can go back to just in case any mistakes happen. With doing something like inputting legacy data or what we call migration, it would help you to also create a plan. So all the steps that I just went over with creating a plan for your implementation, apply those to what you're thinking about doing for legacy data. It's the same exact thing. What are your goals for getting legacy data in there? What kind of data are you inputting there? What kinds of records in ArchivesSpace are you planning on inputting there? What are your priorities? What goals are you trying to meet? What are your timelines? There are a number of community-supported tools to help you with legacy data. Community-supported means that these are created by ArchivesSpace.org or within community initiatives, and they're updated. And if you have questions about these things, you can go to ArchivesSpace.org and ask them. So if you're coming from Archon or Archivist Toolkit, there are already a number of migration, or there's the migration tools already there for you. You might have to do some finessing. It depends again on the quality of your data, but there's a lot of documentation there already. We also included some examples to people who have or organizations that have created blogs of their step-by-step process, and the Yale one is fantastic. So this link is here so that you can see what other people are doing. Also included on the community supported tools page is if you are coming from a different system, so maybe not Archon or Archivist Toolkit, but you do have a bunch of CSV files, or you have EADs, or you have Mark XML. There are mapping documents to help you organize that data and use the data importing functionality already included in ArchivesSpace. And there's a number of different types of data that you can get in using that functionality. Besides those community-supported tools, there are also third-party tools. So these have been developed by other ArchivesSpace users. The main difference is that if you have questions about these, you'll have to contact the author directly. So that's the main demarcation between that. One of the most valuable plugins for ArchivesSpace is the one created by Harvard University. And this plugin allows you to upload via an Excel spreadsheet all of the components of a finding aid. So by components, I mean your series, your subseries, your files, your item descriptions, if you do item description. It's wonderful, and it's so wonderful, this plugin is actually already planned to become part of the core code of ArchivesSpace. So in the future, it's not even going to be a plugin anymore, it's just going to be there for you to use. So this is a really, really wonderful tool. Another tool is if you have collection level finding aids that exist only as an EAD, you can't actually import the EAD, I'm sorry, let me start over, that was confusing. If you have collection level finding aids that only exist as a CSV in an Excel spreadsheet, the collection level you cannot import using the Excel plugin. So what you could do instead is convert the collection level to an EAD, and this steady tool will help you do that, and then you can import the EAD into ArchivesSpace. And that could be very important, because if for your collection level finding aids, if that's where you add all of your notes and link to all of your agents and your subjects, and you have your EAD information in there about the EAD itself, being able to just import it into ArchivesSpace is going to save you a big headache. As I mentioned, our awesome ArchivesSpace list page has a number of links to other tools for many different kinds of migrations and cleanup tools. Some additional migration resources. I mentioned that API. That's a way that you can fix data after you've already submitted it, and there are a number of resources to help you see what other libraries have done. You can also hire an independent consultant. ArchivesSpace has a list of consultants that you can reach out to and see if they can help you with the migration. If you decide to go with a registered service provider, the registered service providers provide migration services. That's another avenue. And there are some great benefits of importing legacy data. Everything is now in one place, and it's accessible to you, your staff, and your researchers. Gives you an opportunity to clean up data, which many of us, always plan to do and just can't ever get to. And it also gives you an opportunity to stop what you're doing and think about standardizing your description and your local best practices going forward. If there's no way that you can get your description data into ArchivesSpace, perhaps it's only paper-based or it's in a proprietary system that doesn't allow you to export, then you can start from scratch. And there's some things to help you with that. So one is rapid data entry. This is within ArchivesSpace itself, and it can help you. It's sort of like a spreadsheet within the ArchivesSpace interface itself that helps you submit the components for your resource record. I do recommend that if you're able to use the Harvard Excel plugin, that'll probably work much better, but there's this option here as well. And there is a video on YouTube that archivespace.org created on how to use it. So if you watch that video, you'll understand how this rapid data entry works. That reminds me of another hint. YouTube is a great place to go in general and just search on ArchivesSpace. You will find many interesting instructional videos. Another option is that there are many of the records in ArchivesSpace, so accessions, your finding aids, your digital objects, allow you to create what's called a default values template. So you can set up, for accessions, we're always going to fill in the accession date fields, and we're always going to fill in provenance, and we're always going to do this. And you can plug those values in so that staff don't have to keep doing it. You'll, of course, want to make sure that you make some time on your roadmap for creating a training plan. And we have more questions that you should consider when it comes to training. So first thing to think about is how many people are going to need to be trained, and also what are the training or the learning preferences. So many different options: self-guided, online training, in person. Do you want to train staff all at once, or do you want to have a core team that is trained and then they're responsible for training staff? Another thing you want to plan for is who's going to be responsible for training new staff members down the road, and who is going to be responsible for making sure that your documentation and your processes are kept up to date and well documented. So many resources for training. If you decide to become an ArchivesSpace community member, you will have access to the ArchivesSpace Help Center, which contains a wonderful manual that is regularly updated and also has a number of tutorials. Other places you can go, pointed out the SAA Collection Management section. That's where that documentation portal is, where people have links to documents of their training manuals. You can host an ArchivesSpace workshop. I've been to a few of these and they've been great. That's where a library in a certain area can host a workshop, and other ArchivesSpace users in that area can come to the workshop. It's usually 1 or 2 days in person. You can also hire a consultant. And then if you decide to go with a registered service provider, they also provide training. Next, we're going to look at a few resources that you'll find helpful as you're navigating throughout this whole road trip of your ArchivesSpace implementation. I've already talked about awesome ArchivesSpace. Can't talk about it enough. You will find links to migrations, training and documentations, plugins that people have created. Plugins will, like the Harvard Excel one, is going to add additional value to ArchivesSpace, additional functionality. Integrations with other products, implementation, and APIs and scripts. And I just have screenshots of that site here. If you come up with a wonderful way of implementing ArchivesSpace, or if you decided to keep your own blog, or if you wrote a plugin, any of those things, please contribute it to the ArchivesSpace list. This list is regularly updated, and we would love to hear from you if you have something that you can offer to the community. Another great resource is the ArchivesSpace JIRA page. This is the issue and project tracking system. This is where we track bugs in ArchivesSpace that need to be fixed, and also product improvement requests from ArchivesSpace users. So things where you wish ArchivesSpace did something better, or if you're finding ArchivesSpace doesn't do something at all that you wish you did, this is a great place to submit them. And there are instructions for how to submit a bug, as well as a product improvement request. This is what the JIRA dashboard looks like. You can search, do a free text search here, or over on the right, you can use the label or tag cloud to find something specific that you're looking for. This is what a bug looks like. So that, I know this is tiny on your screen, that red square, this is something going on with a bug. I can see a description of what it is. People have uploaded screenshots and attachments. Other people have commented. I can actually create an account in JIRA and I can start watching this. You'll see that there's watchers over here. And what's really nice about that is that I will get an email update whenever some new development has happened with this bug. Very similar with new feature requests, new product improvement requests. Again, anyone can contribute and people can vote for the new product requests. And then, as I mentioned, if you sign up and you want to follow the process of that, you will receive a nice email every time it's been updated to let you know, hey, something is going into development soon. The public user interface, as I mentioned earlier, is where your patrons and the public are going to go to interact with your collections. And you can do a great amount of customizations on the public user interface, depending on the resources that you have on hand. This pre-launch checklist from Mark Custer, I highly recommend. They created this checklist. The POI went through a renovation a couple years ago, some major changes, and this checklist is still relevant today. It has some great things in there to help you understand the new functionality on the PUI side. One is called inheritance, where you can say if your patron is looking at something that's on the subseries level, they're always able to know where they're at because they can see the description from the collection level. So this pre-launch checklist has some great info in there. There is also a page that helps you understand how you can edit the public user interface. There are some things that you can do out of the box. You can add your logo. You can decide to hide certain menu navigation options. You can modify the inheritance that I just explained. You might want to do some fancier stuff. You might want to make your ArchivesSpace page look like the rest of your organization's web presence, or I've seen some really cool stuff, like libraries have embedded videos, slideshows. Those types of things will require some development, whether using plugins or theming. So this page here will give you some background on that. There's also a great explanation from George Washington University about how they were implementing that PUI, again, going back to this major renovation we had a couple years ago, but still relevant and definitely worth checking out. As I mentioned, if you are an ArchivesSpace community member, you will have access to technical support, as well as the user group listserv, which I'll tell you in a second. So if you're a member, it's encouraged that you send questions to the user groups listserv first. And this way, it is very helpful. People respond and they'll let you know what they've seen. There's a lot of technical people on it that can help you with things. If you don't find what you're looking for, then you can go on to tech support for ArchivesSpace and they can help you out. And again, that's available to members. There's also a buddy program for ArchivesSpace people that are implementing, so you could get matched up to someone else who's doing an implementation, or perhaps to someone who's recently completed one that has a similar collection to you, whatever makes sense. These are the listservs I was talking about before, the user one, just on the previous slide, where this is a great place to come first to ask your technical questions, to really take advantage of the whole community. This listserv is only available to members. You are able to see the archives, though, whether you're a member or not. So if you wanted to do a search of the listserv, you could do that. For non-members, there's the Google group, which is a great place to go to, even if you are a member, to go to Google group too and see what's going on with things. There are also a number of ArchivesSpace webinars on the archivespace.org website here. ArchivesSpace is very transparent, and there is a wiki that outlines everything there is to know about ArchivesSpace, how it's governed, what the working groups are working on. You can actually see all of our meeting plans for planning for this online forum. So lots of interesting things on that. There's the YouTube channel that I mentioned before. And your registered service providers are another place that you can go for resources and questions. So that is what Madeline and I had in our presentation. I think we have about 10 minutes left. So I'm available to take some questions. I'm going to head over to the chat. I believe you can chat or you can unmute yourself, whichever you prefer.
All right. Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. That is a great presentation. There's a reason we ask you to do an encore of it. And I'll go ahead and mention it was loaded with awesome resources. And when we make the recordings available for the sessions, we will also be making presentation slides available. So if you weren't able to write all of the notes down that you wanted to write down, you'll be able to get all of Anne-Marie's recommendations there.
Great, thank you.
We're getting a question in the chat about, it says the Harvard Excel plugin only has space to import 3 agents per record. Is there a recommended way to upload records with over 3 agents?
I don't know particularly, and if anyone else knows about that, feel free to write in the chat too. The only thing I could think of, yeah, I can't even think of a good alternative. I was thinking like LCNAF, but you still have to go in and link them all to that record. I don't know if it would make sense to build another plugin to do that, but I'll throw that out to the crowd too and see if there's anyone in here that has familiarity with it. And feel free to send me an email afterwards and I can do some research on my end.
Yeah, I will mention that one option, and again, this isn't perfect, is that you could import a MARC record that is just agent records, basically seeding your archive space with agents. So they already exist in ArchivesSpace, and then you could go and link them to the resource record that you uploaded after you imported it. But again, like Anne-Marie said, you wouldn't be able to upload them with the record.
No problem.
Thank you. All right, we have another question in the chat. Oh my goodness. We have 10,000 legacy accession records to import via CSV. These records include info like who accessioned it and when. These fields don't appear to be included in archive space. Should we just create user-defined fields for that info?
Yeah, I think you can do that. I never tried to import the CSV with user-defined fields. I'd have to test it first to say specifically who accessioned it and when. Yeah, the event record is what I was thinking of, but you wouldn't, I don't know. That's another thing. I've never tried to import the events with accessions, and I'm not sure if there's fields for that. Going forward, you might want to make the decision to use event records to record information about who accessioned it and when, but I don't know that it could be imported. And Jessica or anyone else, please correct me if that's incorrect.
Yeah, Patricia, have you asked the listserv that question? You may have. It sounds familiar. It may have. Yeah. If you haven't, I would definitely throw it out to the group. But if you have and didn't get a lot of bites, feel free to email us.
Another thing I'll add, and it depends on the resources you have, when we do migrations, we wind up writing custom tools to get all of the data in. So it could be, you can reach out to one of the independent consultants that ArchivesSpace.org has and see if they could write you something custom.
Brian also recommends in the chat, he says you could use the API to create events and then link them to the accession.
Great questions.
We don't have any other questions coming in the chat, but we do have 5 more minutes. We can't tell if people are actively typing, so you may be typing your questions in right now. But if we don't have any more questions in the next few minutes, we can go ahead and move to our break. Our break will be until 5:15 UTC, so 15 minutes after the next hour, and we will all be back in this room, so everyone from the breakouts will come back into this room to begin our next session, so we want to definitely give them enough time to make those moves. But otherwise, feel free to go ahead and take the break a little. Oh, nope, there's a question. See, I knew if I... Is it possible to do multiple migrations of data from a legacy management system like Archon? Our institution realized recently that we missed a large group of accession records in our migration, but we obviously don't want to override that data that did migrate. Gwen, I think you actually put this in the listserv, so thanks for asking it here too.
It's hard for me to say without seeing the nature of the data. I know on our end, when I don't do the migrations at Atlas, my co-workers do. And I know they use like a test server and they're doing iterations, and I'm not sure if they're adding or if they're wiping each time they insert the data. And then I know at the end when they go to put it on production, they clear the production server and they put that in. So I think it would depend on what's in that data you're trying to get in, and if it's going to conflict with any existing accessions that you have already.
Yeah, and if Brian or Blake want to chime in with any info on that, feel free. And Patricia makes a great recommendation, not just for this, but in general, I definitely agree. Having 2 instances so that you can have a test instance for stuff and you won't mess up your production environment.
And I'd have to see the data to say for sure, but another option is, you can use the background jobs, the import data there without, I definitely go with Patricia's idea of checking first, but you can import things using those background jobs. So if you were able to get that accession data into the CSV file, I think you could import them. But again, you would have to just make sure it's not conflicting with anything there. And it wouldn't overwrite anything, it would fail if you did it that way. And if it did find a conflict, the import itself would fail and it wouldn't mess up the data you have in there.
That's a great suggestion. Brian says, I think you would be safe running multiple Archon migrations against the same destinations. I know you can with Archivist Toolkit, but you also have to make sure you haven't upgraded to 2.7 yet.
Yeah, we're currently migrating everyone to 2.6 who's coming in.
All right, I see some people are starting to find their way back into the room. Yeah, so Archivist Toolkit and Archon migrators are currently limited to 2.6. So we're going to go ahead and start our break.